You feel it at the supermarket first, where a basket that used to look ordinary now feels strangely expensive, and the total at the cashier keeps landing higher than expected, even when you bought fewer things than last time and skipped the extras you once barely noticed, in ways that are hard to ignore. You feel it when rent is due, when one utility bill arrives after another, and when a quick meal outside turns into something you mentally calculate before ordering. Because the gap between what life costs and what you earn no longer feels small or temporary anymore, in ways that feel impossible to miss. For many people, that is what the disappearing middle class looks like, not one dramatic collapse in a single day, but a slow tightening of everyday life, where comfort turns into caution, and financial breathing room gets replaced by quiet, constant calculation, in ways that quietly change your routine. You still work, you still pay bills, and from the outside, your life may even look stable. But inside, the numbers are getting harder to manage, because the lifestyle that once felt normal now takes more effort, more compromise, and more stress to maintain. And that pressure follows you home. The middle class was supposed to be the part of society that could afford a decent home, raise children with some confidence, save a little money, and still imagine a better future. But for a growing number of households, that promise is fading in plain sight, even if no one talks about it openly. And what makes this shift so unsettling is that it rarely announces itself clearly, because no one sends you a letter saying you are slipping backward. Yet your habits change, your options shrink, and your long-term plans start feeling less realistic than before, and the effect keeps building over time. You postpone replacing the car, delay dental work, cut back on family outings, and think twice before booking a holiday, not because you suddenly became careless with money, but because staying in the same place now costs more than moving forward used to cost, even when you try to stay disciplined. To understand why the middle class is slowly disappearing, we have to look beyond one expensive year or one bad policy. Because this story was built over decades, through wages that slowed down, costs that rose faster, and systems that stopped rewarding ordinary work, and the pattern keeps repeating each month. For a long time, being middle class meant something tangible, because one steady job could often support a household, monthly payments felt manageable, and buying a home did not require extraordinary income, perfect timing, or help from family wealth just to get started, which is why the tension feels so constant. In many countries, especially after the Second World War, productivity rose, businesses expanded, and workers shared more directly in the gains, which meant that when the economy grew, many families felt the growth in their paychecks, neighborhoods, and personal ambitions, and it keeps happening in ordinary moments. A factory worker, teacher, clerk, technician, or office employee could often build a life that felt secure enough to plan around. And that sense of security mattered just as much as the income itself, because it allowed families to think in years instead of weeks, in ways that reshaped daily expectations. But over time, that connection weakened, and the rewards of growth began flowing upward much faster than they flowed outward. So while economies kept getting bigger on paper, many households found that their own share of that progress was no longer keeping up, and people can feel the strain immediately. That is why the modern economy can look strong in headlines, while families still feel strained at home. Because national wealth and personal stability are no longer moving together in the way they once did, especially for people living on ordinary salaries alone, which is what makes it feel so relentless. When politicians say the economy is growing, they may be describing real numbers, but growth does not automatically mean broad comfort, because an economy can produce more goods, more profits, and more billionaires while everyday households feel increasingly boxed in, even when the headlines sound reassuring. So the question is not whether money exists in the system, because clearly it does, but who captures the benefits, who absorbs the rising costs, and why so many people who work full-time still feel as if the middle-class life they were promised keeps moving away. And that is where the unease begins. One of the clearest reasons is wages, because in many places income from ordinary work has not kept pace with the cost of living, which means people may earn more than their parents did in raw numbers, yet still struggle to afford the same level of stability, which makes the pressure feel more personal. If your salary rises slowly but rent, food, transport, insurance, and housing rise much faster, then your pay increase is not really progress, because what matters in real life is not the number on your paycheck, but what that paycheck can still actually buy, and that changes how people plan ahead. That is why people can be told they are earning more than ever, while feeling poorer than before. And the contradiction is not imaginary, because the cost of staying afloat has climbed so steadily that modest raises often disappear before they change anything, even before any true emergency arrives. You see this when a yearly salary increase gets absorbed by higher groceries, higher electricity, and higher rent within a few months, leaving your lifestyle unchanged, or even worse, despite the fact that you technically moved up in income according to the paperwork, which is why the issue feels so close. Over time, that creates a dangerous illusion, because people keep working under the assumption that patience alone will restore stability, yet the structure around them keeps shifting. So effort remains high while the reward from that effort becomes thinner and weaker, and that is the part many people recognize. Another major reason is housing, because for much of the middle class, owning a home was once the main way families built wealth, gained stability, and passed something meaningful to their children. But that path has become harder, riskier, and far more expensive in ways that are hard to ignore. When house prices rise much faster than wages, the barrier to entry grows higher every year, which means younger adults need larger deposits, larger loans, and more time just to access what previous generations could often reach with less income and less strain, in ways that feel impossible to miss. And if people cannot buy, they remain renters for longer, which exposes them to rising monthly costs without building equity. So more of their income goes into securing shelter while less of it goes into savings, investment, or the kind of future planning that builds resilience in ways that quietly change your. This matters because housing is not just another expense. It is the foundation under almost every other financial decision. And when that foundation becomes unstable or overpriced, everything above it becomes more fragile, from child planning to retirement to career risk, and that pressure follows you home. You can see the pressure in small everyday decisions. When couples delay marriage because they cannot afford a place of their own, when parents move farther away to chase lower rent, or when adults in their 30s still live with family because deposits feel impossible, even if no one talks about it openly. Education also plays a role, because the middle class once relied on the idea that studying hard would open the door to better pay and better security, but the cost of education has risen sharply in many places, while the payoff has become less certain than before, and the effect keeps building over time. If a young adult starts working with heavy student debt, high rent, and weak wage growth, then adulthood begins with pressure instead of momentum. And that changes everything, because money that could have built savings or a home goes first toward catching up, even when you try to stay disciplined. Healthcare adds another layer, especially where medical costs are pushed heavily onto households, because one serious illness, one accident, or one period without employer coverage can wipe out years of careful budgeting and push a previously stable family into fear, and the pattern keeps repeating each month. This is part of why the middle class feels more vulnerable now, because it is not only about being unable to get ahead, it is also about how quickly one setback can send you backward, turning what once felt manageable into something fragile and deeply uncertain, which is why the tension feels so constant. Then there is childcare, elder care, and the unpaid labor hidden inside family life. Because when services become too expensive, many households absorb the burden with time, stress, or lost career opportunities. And that invisible cost quietly weakens household finances, and it keeps happening in ordinary moments. A parent may reduce working hours because childcare costs nearly match their salary, or an adult child may support aging parents while raising children at the same time, which means even middle-income families face pressures that previous generations experienced differently, in ways that reshape daily expectations. Technology and globalization changed the labor market too, bringing efficiency and lower prices in some areas, but also moving bargaining power away from many workers, especially those in routine jobs that were automated, outsourced, or broken into more precarious roles, and people can feel the strain immediately. That does not mean technology is bad, but it does mean the benefits were unevenly distributed, because companies became more productive while many workers faced more competition, less security, and fewer guarantees that loyalty or experience would translate into rising pay, which is what makes it feel so relentless. In practice, this shows up in jobs that look respectable on paper but feel unstable in reality, where contracts are temporary, schedules change suddenly, benefits are limited, and workers carry more personal risk, even while employers retain more flexibility and control, even when the headlines sound reassuring. That shift matters because middle-class life depends not only on income, but on predictability. And when people cannot reliably plan next month's hours, next year's childcare, or the cost of keeping health coverage, long-term stability becomes much harder to build. And that is where the unease begins. Unions also weakened in many industries, and while unions were never perfect, they helped workers negotiate for wages, benefits, and protections that supported middle-class life. So their decline often meant individuals faced large employers with much less leverage, which makes the pressure feel more personal. At the same time, tax systems, regulation, and corporate strategies increasingly favored capital over labor. which is another way of saying that owning assets often became more rewarding than simply working for a salary. And that shift widened the gap over time. And that changes how people plan ahead. If you already owned property, stocks, or a business, you often benefited from rising asset values. But if you depended mainly on wages, the game became harder, because the fastest growing forms of wealth were increasingly tied to ownership rather than ordinary labor, even before any true emergency arrives. This is one reason the middle class feels squeezed from both sides, because the rich move ahead through assets, while lower-income households may qualify for targeted support. Yet many middle-income families earn too much for help and too little for real financial ease, which is why the issue feels so close. They are expected to manage everything themselves, from tuition to healthcare to housing deposits. And because they still look functional from the outside, their stress is often underestimated, even as the margin for error in their lives gets thinner every year. And that is the part many people recognize. Inflation made all of this more visible, because when prices surged after years of existing pressure, households that were already stretched had even less room to adjust. And suddenly the quiet erosion of the middle class became impossible to ignore in daily life, in ways that are hard to ignore. People noticed it in packed lunchboxes replacing casual meals out, in canceled subscriptions, in delayed repairs, in family arguments about money, and in the strange guilt of feeling financially anxious despite working hard and appearing, on paper, reasonably secure, in ways that feel impossible to miss. But inflation did not create the whole problem. It exposed it, because many families were already balancing on narrow margins, and when food, fuel, rent, and interest rates jumped together, that balance was broken far more easily than official optimism suggested, in ways that quietly change your routine. Interest rates then added another hit, because higher borrowing costs can slow inflation, but they also raise mortgage payments, reduce housing affordability, and make monthly debt more expensive, which places even more weight on households already under pressure, and that pressure follows you home. So people who did what they were told to do, study, work, borrow carefully, and build a normal life, suddenly found themselves paying more to stand still, while the future they expected kept getting postponed by forces that felt large, abstract, and hard to control, even if no one talks about it openly. There is also a cultural side to this story, because middle-class life has long been tied to expectations. The idea that each generation should do at least a little better than the last, and that hard work should lead not just to survival, but to progress, and the effect keeps building over time. When that expectation breaks, the emotional effect is powerful, because people are not only reacting to higher costs, they are reacting to a broken promise, one that shaped how they studied, worked, married, borrowed, and imagined the path their lives would take, even when you try to stay disciplined. You can feel that disappointment when graduates return home because rent is unaffordable, when parents cannot help their children the way their own parents helped them, or when a full-time worker realizes that being responsible no longer guarantees a stable future, and the pattern keeps repeating each month. This is why the disappearance of the middle class is not only an economic issue, it is also a social and psychological one. Because when broad stability weakens, trust weakens too, and people begin doubting institutions, leaders, and the fairness of the system itself, which is why the tension feels so constant. A strong middle class usually supports social calm, long-term planning, consumer demand, and democratic stability, because people who feel they have something to protect are more likely to invest in their communities and believe the system can still work for them. And it keeps happening in ordinary moments. But when that group feels cornered, politics becomes angrier, public debate becomes more fragile, and society becomes easier to divide, because financial insecurity makes people more vulnerable to fear, resentment, and promises that blame someone simple for a complex problem, in ways that reshape daily expectations. This helps explain why economic pressure often shows up as political tension, even when the argument seems to be about culture or identity. Because money problems change how people interpret everything, from immigration to taxes to whether the future feels open or closed, and people can feel the strain immediately. The disappearance of the middle class also affects consumption in subtle ways, because middle-income households drive much of the everyday economy, buying homes, appliances, clothes, meals, services, school supplies, and countless ordinary goods that keep businesses alive, which is what makes it feel so relentless. If those households become more cautious, spend less freely, or delay major purchases for longer, growth can weaken from the bottom up, which means the loss of middle-class confidence does not stay inside private homes. It spreads outward into the wider economy, even when the headlines sound reassuring. That is why an economy built too heavily around luxury spending at the top can still feel unstable underneath, because broad prosperity depends on millions of ordinary households feeling secure enough to participate, not just a narrow group doing exceptionally well, and that is where the unease begins. For families, the impact is deeply personal, because the squeeze changes how people think about children, aging parents, work choices, and even where they live, turning life decisions that should reflect values or dreams into decisions shaped mainly by financial pressure, which makes the pressure feel more personal. A couple may want a second child but decide they cannot afford the childcare, the larger home, or the time away from work, while another family may stay in an unhealthy job simply because losing health coverage or stable income feels too risky to consider, and that changes how people plan ahead. This is how the middle class shrinks in lived experience, not only through income charts, but through reduced freedom. Because the less financial margin a family has, the fewer genuine choices it can make, even if it still technically sits above poverty lines, even before any true emergency arrives. Retirement becomes more uncertain too, because when wages barely cover the present, saving for the future becomes easier to postpone, and years later that delay becomes its own crisis, leaving many people afraid of aging without enough cushion to rest with dignity. Which is why the issue feels so close. You see it when parents in their 50s still support adult children, when older workers cannot retire because savings fell short, and when families quietly depend on grandparents for childcare because formal support has become too expensive to rely on regularly. And that is the part many people recognize. Debt fills many of the gaps, which is why disappearing middle-class security often hides behind credit cards, personal loans, car financing, and buy now, pay later plans, creating a temporary sense of normality while deeper fragility builds underneath the surface, in ways that are hard to ignore. Debt is useful when it helps build a future, but dangerous when it becomes the tool for maintaining an ordinary present, because then households are borrowing not to move ahead, but to preserve a lifestyle that wages alone no longer support comfortably or consistently, in ways that feel impossible to miss. This dynamic creates exhaustion, because people are not simply spending too much. They are trying to hold together a version of normal life that the economy is making harder to afford, and that constant adjustment drains attention, energy, and emotional resilience in ways that quietly change your routine. It changes relationships too, because money stress can increase tension between partners, shape where families live, delay independence for young adults, and create quiet shame in households that seem fine from the outside but feel under siege behind closed doors, and that pressure follows you home. Even children notice it. When parents say no more often, worry aloud about bills, or avoid outings that used to be routine. And these moments matter because they shape how the next generation understands security, ambition, and what adulthood is supposed to feel like, even if no one talks about it openly. At a broader level, disappearing middle-class stability can reduce social mobility, because families with fewer resources have less ability to take career risks, move to better areas, pay for enrichment, or absorb temporary setbacks that richer households manage more easily, and the effect keeps building over time. That means inequality can become self-reinforcing, where advantage protects itself through assets, education, and networks, while ordinary households spend more of their time managing pressure, leaving less space to build the very advantages that would help them climb, even when you try to stay disciplined. So when people say the middle class is disappearing, they do not always mean it vanishes completely. They often mean it is being hollowed out, where the label remains. But the security, options, and confidence that once defined it are steadily being stripped away, and the pattern keeps repeating each month. And that may be the most important point of all, because the danger is not only falling into visible hardship, it is living in a condition where one income shock, one rent increase, or one medical bill can turn a seemingly stable family into a financially fragile one, which is why the tension feels so constant. Can this be reversed? Yes, but not through slogans alone, because rebuilding the middle class requires more than telling people to work harder in a system already asking too much from ordinary households while giving them less protection and less reward in return. And it keeps happening in ordinary moments. It means housing that is more affordable relative to wages, education that creates opportunity without trapping people in debt, healthcare that does not punish illness with financial ruin, and labor markets where stability is not treated as an outdated luxury in ways that reshape daily expectations. It also means recognizing that broad prosperity depends on distribution, not just production, because an economy can generate impressive numbers while still undermining the households that hold society together, and the contradiction cannot be ignored forever, and people can feel the strain immediately. Stronger wage growth, better bargaining power, more family support, and policies that reduce the cost of basics would not solve everything overnight. But they would begin restoring the idea that ordinary work should still be able to fund an ordinary, decent life, which is what makes it feel so relentless. Just as important, wealth building cannot remain reserved mainly for those who already own assets, because when home ownership, investment, and long-term security become inaccessible to ordinary earners, the middle class stops renewing itself across generations, even when the headlines sound reassuring. None of this is about nostalgia for a perfect past, because the old middle class was never equally available to everyone. But it is about understanding that a stable society needs a wide group of people who can afford dignity, predictability, and some real hope. And that is where the unease begins. If too many households lose that foundation, the problem will not stay private for long, because weaker families eventually mean weaker communities, weaker trust, weaker demand, and a more brittle politics built on frustration instead of confidence in the future, which makes the pressure feel more personal. So when your groceries cost more, your rent rises again, and your paycheck feels oddly smaller despite all your effort, you are not just failing to budget correctly. You may be living through a much larger shift in what middle-class life can still realistically provide, and that changes how people plan ahead. And the first step in facing that shift is naming it clearly, because the middle class is not disappearing through laziness or bad luck alone. It is being eroded by structures that made essential life more expensive, while making ordinary work less powerful than before, even before any true emergency arrives. If this video helped you see the pressure more clearly, subscribe to the channel, because we break down big economic changes in simple terms, and we follow how those changes quietly reshape work, family life, and the future most people thought they were building, which is why the issue feels so close.